This is a talk by Amr. I was in what was it? I don't even know where it was, but I saw him deliver a talk, and it was I mean it was as if I was on a spacecraft going many millions miles per hour. He is so fast in his presentation. It was amazing. Amr, he's an African Egyptian native who crossed continents to work with his passion in digital environments. His interests span from technology to tech communities to politics in tech, and well, that all enriched through some various software engineering roles in Egypt, Hungary, and Germany. Currently, he's living in Germany, where he's in Berlin, a co-organizer of rugby and co-curious, the thing formerly known as Rails Girls Berlin. Amr, it's you, man. Go for it.
So I hope everyone can hear me, and I have to admit this is quite an interesting setup to be talking to a computer, but I hope my voice will be clear. So let's start by this. As Arno was mentioning, and thank you, Arno, for the introduction. Like, we usually speak about different topics, things that relate to politics, things that relate to communities and stuff. But every topic that I speak about usually have this slide. So this slide exists in almost any presentation I ever gave.
One question, Amr.
Yes?
You're a bit hard to hear. Can you make sure that you're... Yeah, you don't have to hold it, but it was as if you were talking off mic.
Okay, then let me try this. Sorry. Is it better now?
I think it is better now, yeah. I hope you don't have to hold it all the time.
No, I mean, I hope now it's working properly. Please tell me that.
Okay.
That's good?
Sorry for interrupting. Yes, it's...
Okay, perfect.
I was never here.
So, sorry for this interruption. I think, like this slide, I really have it in almost any presentation I ever give. Technical excellence and technical skills are really important. Like, there is no doubt about that. But I think all of us need to always remember that communities are the things that matter the most. And that when we write software, we write it with other people. So we don't usually write software alone. And we also write it for other people to use, right? So a software that is just a software that is the best software on earth, if it's not used by other people, if it doesn't involve a community, it's not really an important software. So I will start by telling a story of two of my closest friends, Alejandra and Yuri. And this story goes back, I think, like 1 month before the Corona times, where I got this call. So they are partners, and I got this call like a few months ago where Yuri said, "Hey, I bought the ring," and I went like, "Yay, congrats, man, that's awesome." And he said, "It is Ruby," and I was like, "What? What is this guy talking about?" Then he's like, "The gem is Ruby." I was like, "What?" Now I'm even more confused. What are you talking about? And then he's like, "You know, the ring. This ring has this gem. The gem on it is Ruby." And he said, like, "I think it is Ruby that got us together, and I thought the ring should have a Ruby for that." And honestly, at this moment, I remember like sitting down and reflecting to myself that like we complain a lot. I specifically complain a lot. So if you watched other talks of mine, like my last talk that I delivered is called "What's Wrong with Ruby?" So I complain a lot about things, about the language, right? Like I complain a lot about things in the language itself, in the frameworks around Ruby, about the community of Ruby sometimes in many cases. But I just wanted to start this presentation by saying how grateful I am for belonging to this community, right? How grateful, because the Ruby community is the community that I learned the most from in the past few years. And also wanted to congratulate my two friends, Yuri and Alejandro, and give thanks to everyone in this talk or who will watch this talk later, or like anyone from my Ruby friends in the last few years. So, who am I? My name is Amr Abdelwahab. I know how hard this name is. Just ignore it. It's fine. I'm a tech lead at a company, startup based in Berlin called Tourlane. If you want to know more about it, ask me later, but mostly we do travel tech. As Arno thankfully mentioned, I'm a very active member of the Ruby community in the past few years, especially in Europe. So I work with Code Curious, which is the Rails Girls Berlin chapter, the Ruby user group in Berlin. I was the chair organizer of Euroko 2017 in Budapest. And I was born and raised in Cairo in Egypt, and then moved to Budapest in 2013. And then I moved to Germany, to Berlin in 2017. And here comes the question that I always ask myself when I have a new idea for a new talk. Why do you think this talk should be interesting? Why do you think this talk is relevant? And I think it is no secret that now we are living in this era of distributed systems architecture. I wouldn't even call it microservices, even though everyone likes to call it like that. But at least it's a very uncommon thing to find a company nowadays that just builds a monolith, right? There are some, but it's a very uncommon thing. And this introduces a lot of benefits, but also introduces a new layers of some complexity, right? Because in the past, you used to need to only bootstrap a service once, twice, maybe in the whole company lifetime. But now you're bootstrapping new services almost every couple of weeks, at least. And you're also in this era where companies grow and the turnover rate in developer companies is really high usually. So you always have a lot of new people joining teams, a lot of people trying to get this new repo and wanting to set it up quickly. So you need to have a much easier development setup. And we need to kind of stay consistent, especially in such a technically diverse sphere. Like technology is changing super fast. You want to try out new technologies here and there. There is this new framework, there's this new language that you want to try out. And you need to kind of keep people consistent within the same sphere. And honestly, like it's kind of too late now to still have such problems as it works on my machine, but it doesn't work on staging. Like this is kind of a very old problem. But then the question second after this is like, yes, this is an interesting topic I think people want to hear about, but why me? I mean, why do I think I will have an extra bit to add to this topic? And I think it's important to start by saying, like, I wasn't on the upside of things. Most of my experience is, like, most of the people I think in this room is a Ruby developer on the back-end side of things. So I'm mostly on the application development side of things. However, since the very beginning of Docker, I am a huge fan of the idea. And for me, I'm actually a huge fan of containerization tools, because just like Ruby, both of them are about the idea of developer happiness. I'm making a tool that makes you as a developer comfortable so we can actually produce better quality. And because of the rise of the DevOps culture in the past few years, I think I was, for some reason, really, it was a lucky thing that I was always the guy in the team that people would say, like, yeah, we would like to Dockerize things, like, just, lead such project. And I have had this in several companies in the past few years. And it's important to say, like, I did, and I am still doing, probably I might even show you things that can be better in the tips and tricks that I will show you today. However, I think I have one success that I'm really proud of. So I think that people who are usually labeled senior engineers, right, like I insist on this label, right, are usually harder to let go of their opinions, because it's a long experience and changing habits is not that easy. And I remember changing someone's opinion before changing the Docker setup, because at the beginning he was saying things like, no, I don't like Docker. I think, yeah, Docker can exist, but it's a personal preference if you want to use it or not, or whatever. To then later, after changing the setup and putting these tips and tricks, when he went back to one of the older projects that didn't have Docker set up properly, he said that, yeah, it took a while, and I will never ever do anything without Docker containers again, and I feel like a dinosaur and stuff like that. So for me, that is the real success, is making people really pleased with the Docker setup. So a bit of theory, right? Like containerization in general, not just Docker. All these tools, what is it about? It is simply, you have your application that has some requirements, and you are taking it in an isolated space outside your main machine, outside where it's running. So regardless of the machine it's running on, it has everything it requires to run in this isolated space. And of course, this should guarantee that regardless of which machine it's working on, it will work the same everywhere. And these are the promises they usually promise. Like this actually comes from the website of Docker, I think, that you are able to onboard faster, and you are going to stop wasting hours trying to set up development environments, that you are able to spin up new instances and make copies of your production in your local machine, and that supposedly it enables you to have polyglot development, because you have the same abstraction over the same different tools. They also talk about eliminating the environment inconsistencies, the whole work on my machine thing, and even eliminating concerns over application security. In my opinion, these are great. Like this basically matches the exact layers of complexity that I was mentioning in the rise of distributed systems architectures. And Docker sincerely is conceptually a very easy tool. If you think about it, Docker files have around 12 commands, and mostly people use 6 of them. So it's not about the syntax, it's not about like how hard or complex the tool is. However, it again boils down to people and communities. Like people, it's not just about how easy the tool is, but the people and the communities and how communities deal with this tool. And I still honestly believe that there is a steep learning curve, especially for application developers that have been there for a while before Docker and have their own setup and have their own way how their habits, how the thing is going on. As I said, changing a habit is never an easy thing. And honestly, especially in the Ruby sphere, this problem exists. We have a massive, massive, massive amount of outdated and wrong resources about Docker setups. Like so many times I have read articles, blog posts, even talks in huge conferences where the tips that were shared maybe were good, but they were good maybe a few years ago, and there are already features in Docker that gets over this. Finally, and I think this is the biggest problem I see with Docker in the past few years, especially in the Ruby sphere, is that Docker offers some things, and we have some requirements as application developers, right? And honestly, these things were never connected correctly. So in my opinion, what people usually did was, we would like to try out this new Docker thing, so let's Dockerize the project. And they just never thought about how they really want to use it and how can they use Docker as a tool to fulfill our own requirements. So I thought again, like, what are our usual requirements nowadays? Our usual requirements is, as I said, and this is the third time I have a slide that mentions this, right? And easy to set up and use. Setup is one thing. So yes, easy to set up. So I just got a new computer, I press one link, but use on daily basis is a very important thing. So it's not just about having an easy starting up the server, but being able to run daily commands, being able to do everything you are usually used to do on the development environment in an easy way. Of course, we need to have like a build server, like a CI, right, that will run the tests and lint for every commit. Usually, you want to have the same build server able to build the live, image and then push it to deploy it on merges. And you have a live stage that can scale easily. So it has one thing, you can make it 2, you can make it 3. And I think these are really our 4 requirements in every company. And I think, as I mentioned, we need to make connections. We need to remember what are our requirements and then see what Docker offers to fulfill these requirements, not the opposite. So let's get a bit to some technical side, right? Like, I will speak about a development setup of what I call a simple Rails application. And by simple here, I don't mean like to oversimplify, but like one of the most common Rails applications you will have nowadays, which is simply an application that has at least 4 processes usually running if you want to have it running, right? Like you have a web server, you have a Puma server that is serving your requests, respond, and you have usually a database server running, like say Postgres or NoSQL database or MySQL or whatsoever database you choose, but you still have a process that's running, and your web server needs to have access to this process somehow. You also, most of the applications now, they would have a background worker process, like the other talk now is talking about Sidekick, for example. So yeah, you would have a Sidekick there, process running, and you will always have a queue, right? Like Redis, let's say, for example, where you're dumping the web server is dumping the job there in the queue, and then the background job is processing this from that queue. So this is really nowadays kind of the most common Rails applications would have at least those 4 components. And as I mentioned, what are the day-to-day commands? Like this sounds like weird that I have to repeat this, but honestly, people often forget that we run tests, right? Like when we are in development, I need to have an easy way to run tests without Docker setup, without any other setup. You just run rspec or minitest or whatever. You just have one command and you're running tests. You are running linters, so let's say Robocop, right? You are running rake tasks, you are running Rails generators, you are updating dependencies. So usually in the workflow, you are just changing the gem file and you are basically running bundle install and it updates. You have the migration management, so you create a new migration, you run the migration, you roll back a migration, all these kind of things. The simple one is starting a development server, and here I'm not just talking about starting the web server, but starting the whole thing, right? Like starting the 4 processes at the same time, making sure that the whole application is running in your development environment. And you are sometimes also firing up the development console because you want to try something out and you want to load your environment in there. So for me, my setup has 2 constraints and 2 main constraints. First one is I am minimizing the changes in your day-to-day commands. So what you are used to should still more or less work without you realizing, without you caring if this is Docker or no Docker setup, it should still feel the same. The second thing is honestly hiding the setup complexity, because I don't want a junior developer to care if this is running in Docker or this is running in your local machine or whatever. I just want them to be able to set up the application quickly, develop something, push code. I don't want them to every single time need to learn about Docker and understand the Docker commands and everything like that. So for that, for development, you need to rely on the three important tools. You cannot just rely on having a Docker file. And this is one of the biggest, in my opinion, biggest mistakes in most of tutorials, is that it's trying to build a Docker container that will just run naturally in development. And that's not really necessary. So Dockerfile will enable you to set up this Docker image, this Docker template, right? The template that every time you are creating a container from will run your application in. The second thing that we will use is Docker Compose. Docker Compose is this tool that comes with Docker, installed with Docker, so it's nothing different or nothing extra, that enables you to orchestrate how this container that you will build out of this image deal with the host machine, right? How will it react with the machine it's running in? Also, it enables you to orchestrate how it deals with other Docker containers, right? So this is really cool, because you have the ability to use things from your machine, like the file system or the HTTP ports, and you also have the ability to communicate between processes. Like I mentioned, the web server needs to communicate to the database and so on. Finally, and I think often, like lately started to become more common, but in the past, Ruby developers didn't really make use of Makefiles, but I believe that we need to have abstractions on the top of any setup we have, because today Docker is the thing. Who knows what can be the thing in 2-3 years from now. So let's start by the Docker file. I believe this is the one, as I mentioned, that has a lot of wrong examples on the internet, especially that a lot of them say that this is tips and tricks that focuses on security or performance in development. This is not what development is really about. I haven't seen much focusing on making it better for a developer. I haven't seen much focusing on developer happiness or usability in development environment. And honestly, a lot of 90% of the examples I usually see are from the era before what's called the multi-stage Docker files. And that's why I'm pretty sure many of you in your companies, I can even bet, have two Docker files, one Docker file for development and one Docker file for production, which used to be called the builder pattern. I don't think you need that anymore, because there is such a thing as the multi-stage builds, multi-stage Docker file, which goes like this, right? At the beginning, you can say that this stage that I'm starting to define is going to be the development stage. And as I will later on show you in this talk, you can take from this development stage and go in a branch for, let's say, CI, and then you can take and go to another branch for like production. This is something that you can do with Docker files nowadays, naming stages. As I said, the development stage, in my opinion, should build an image that enables you to run these day-to-day commands. It should not build an image that will run on its own. No. With the ability of having another Makefile and having another Docker Compose file, it should enable you to run all these day-to-day commands without needing to install anything else on your machine but Docker. Second thing I want to talk about is this base image, right? In Docker, for people who don't know Docker at all, you can start from a base image, something that is already have some stuff installed on it. And Docker Hub, which is like a repository with a lot of, an online repository with a lot of images that are available there, has a lot of them. However, I would like to give my first tip here. Make sure to not use public images for critical projects, even if you put a tag, a specific tag, because Docker Hub enables the author of the repo to actually override this tag. A problem that I have seen multiple times, even in the Ruby base image, that sometimes, I think a year ago, Ruby base image of 2.6.3 got broken in production, and then everyone that was using the public image was in a problem. What I would recommend is have your own repository where you basically copy the base image and then update it every once in a while. And then maybe even you can add more layers because you have it in your organization always with this. The second thing is, this is also a very important thing. A lot of the tutorials would ask you for a normal Rails application to just use a normal Ruby base image. So what's a base image? A base image, as I mentioned, is just a container that has already a Linux distro installed in it, and then it has also like Ruby installed in it and bundler installed in it and few things. The Alpine images uses a Linux distro which is really small, and you want your Docker image to be really small because of security reasons, because of performance reasons, because of even cost reasons if you are uploading your application somewhere. So at least in my experience, most of the times an Alpine image is more than enough. You need to install few more things, but that's it. Most of the times an Alpine image would work. Of course, there are exceptional cases, but try at least to go for an Alpine image as much as you can. So yes, now we have the Linux distro that has the Ruby installed on the top of it, right? And it has some the bundler installed on it, and now you want to install your gems. Usually your gems requires specific dependencies to install themselves, right? For example, you need libxml for Nokogiri to install, right? Or you need a PG client for Postgres gem to install. So you need sometimes some native extensions installed on this machine. So usually the Dockerfile second line would usually look something around like this, right? So you are adding these libraries that you need. And here is another tip that I would recommend. Hide the underlying setup. Don't make developers need to change the Dockerfile often, because developers, when they, especially someone who's not familiar with Docker, when they want to like change the Dockerfile, they get a bit confused. So what I usually do is create a file called .build dependencies or .build deps, and this file lives in your project and it has all these dependencies that you need to have. And then in this case, you don't need to change the Dockerfile, and you just have those two lines. The first line will basically copy this into your container so that it will cache it unless it changes. If it changes, it invalidates the cache. And then it runs the installation of every dependency in this build deps file. And then comes for me, honestly, the biggest mistake in almost every tutorial, including some of the official tutorials that comes from Docker. As I said, most of the Docker files setups I have seen in development environment, right, usually start by trying to install the bundle in the Docker cache. By that, I mean you will often see those two lines in your Docker file for development environment. Those two lines does the following. The first line is basically copying the gem files from your host machine to your container or to your image, and then they're basically running bundle install. So what will happen in this case is that every single time you are changing the gem file, you will have to rebuild the image, right? So you have to rebuild the template where your container starts from. And what will happen also is that when you are rebuilding this time, it will invalidate the cache. So it will remove the gem file, copy the new gem file, and then remove the whole bundle that you just installed, and then reinstall the whole bundle from scratch. This, honestly, has always been the thing that developers complained about when they tried Docker in development, especially in the Ruby sphere. So my recommendation is to install in development, right? To install the bundle in container runtime. So you have the image, right, the template that will not have a bundle at all. And then every time you are starting a new container, you are installing the bundle there. And then you are using a cache, which I will show you later, so that it caches it in your file system. How to do that? That goes through two steps. First step is in your Docker file, you are going to set up some environmental variables. That's it. You are going to say that the bundle path should be /bundle, bundle bin should be this, gem home should be this, and attach this to your path. What this is doing is telling to your machine, to your container, any container that starts out of this image, whenever you run bundle install, it will try to install your bundle in /bundle, and that's it, right? So, okay, this doesn't change anything, because then every time I delete that container, every time I stop that container, I lose the bundle, and then I'm starting over. So here comes the second step. In Docker Compose, you have the ability to mount volumes. By mounting volumes, you are saying that everything inside that container that is going to /bundle should be installed to a Docker volume. What is a Docker volume? A Docker volume is some place in your file system managed by Docker daemon you don't even need to care about. All you need to do is just tell it that I need a new volume called bundle, and you are saying that anything inside this container should go to this bundle. This way, every single time you are deleting the containers, you are starting over, you have your bundle cached in your file system of your computer. And all you need to do every single time you have a new change in the gem file is really changing the gem file, running bundle install in the container, and it will use the cache. And that's it. So this is really how the Dockerfile setup should look in development for Ruby projects, in my opinion. as I mentioned, Docker Compose, and I will not spend much time on it, right? Docker Compose is this thing that enables you to define multiple services. If this is, in my opinion, should be the way you define this, right? So if you look, it has the interesting thing is that I have a file to start the development server just for the web server in this case. So this is just the web server. And that I am saying that the target here needs to have the name of the stage. So if your Docker file have CI or live, you should just specify here dev. You're also using env files, so that comes from Docker Compose, so you don't need to install the .env or anything else. You're just saying anything in this file should be available in the development environment. And you are defining other services. For example, Postgres, you can get it from an image from Docker Hub. You don't need to do anything or build anything on your machine. The worker is almost exactly the same as the web server, right? Because it needs the same bundle installed, it needs the same image and everything. The only difference is that this time the command is not starting the web server, but starting Sidekick. And Redis is again an image from Docker Hub. To point out something, especially here, you have this concept of depends on, right? Which means that once this container is started, it needs to have those two other containers started. However, that does not mean that the process inside this container is started. So for example, if your application depends on the database, this here does not guarantee that Postgres, that the process inside the container is started. It just guarantees that the container itself started. So if you face this problem that usually for the first few seconds, you cannot reach the database, you need to change your start to dev server bash script to keep pinging until the database is ready and then start to do that. Finally, and I think this is the most important piece out of this talk, is the Makefile. What I do is usually have a make dev command, and what this will do is basically start a shell in the web container. So it will spin off a new container out of the image that I said in the dev environment, and it will open a shell for you. And in this shell, you can type everything as you are used to in your usual shell. Also, a small tweak that I do in the Docker and the Makefile is have this aliases so that I don't need to type every time Docker compose run or whatever. And then I have the dev, as I mentioned, which will look like this. And I usually have those few commands. The first one is build development. So this will basically build the images, the bundle, which will run the bundle install, the db create that starts the database, migrate, and whatsoever. This enables us to have a command, which is make setup. So in this case, every single project in my organization where I work now, in every organization I did this project, have this command make setup, where you just pull it and you write make setup and everything starts and becomes in place. Okay, so this is it with the development environment. What to do in the CI. I just want to show here, like, this is how cool the multi-stage build is, because you start from dev, and you do another stage, which is CI. In this case, because you will not change the gem file in the CI anyways, you can rely on the Docker cache, right? And you can do this, and you are copying your whole project, and you are starting the thing. Also, if you want, or I think you should use Docker Compose, or even use whatever provided. My current suggestion is to always rely on things that are not specific to a specific CI, because if you want to change the CI from one platform to the other, you are always relying on things like Docker, Docker Compose, and Makefile. So I will also use another Docker CI, another Docker Compose file with this time a different target, right? You can even do things like stateless web, where you have the same exact service. It just does not depend on the database, because you just want to run the linter and still use Makefile or some alternative. And for live stages, I start again from dev. And this time I'm installing the bundle, but deployment without the test and development, because it's different. Or say, for example, I just want to set up the Rails environment variable to staging from live. Enormous possibility starts when you start to talk about multi-stage builds. Let's say it like this. So in a nutshell, like, what I have been trying to say during this talk is nothing about like the specific tips and tricks, but always reminding people that we are optimizing for our usage, for the people, not because we want to use this new cool tool. We need to always question what we copy and paste, because it doesn't necessarily mean it's good. And honestly, in my opinion, having Docker in development or any containerization development is no longer a personal preference, but it is a business requirement. Without it, the business is in danger to lose a lot of money. And to remind ourselves that we need to use the tools to fulfill our requirements, not the opposite way, And if you would like to take a look at this code, I mean, I have this boilerplate somewhere in my GitHub, maybe needs some tweaks, or you want to suggest or have some discussion there, please check it. And please stay connected with me. That's my Twitter handle. And that's it. Thank you so much.
And as far as I know, that means we are here as well. That's nice, by the way. The trick with the Makefile, especially, is something that made me very happy. I want to thank you for your talk. We're going to have a look at the developer dilemmas right now, and then we'll come back with some questions and hopefully answers. So those developer dilemmas. So especially fitting for this talk, it's going to be monolith, microservices. I'm choosing monolith. I am very happy to host it under Docker, but the monolith usually tells me that I have a team and I can get to know everyone. If you just have a hordes and hordes and hordes of monoliths, then usually you don't know all your colleagues. And I really like to know all my colleagues. So first question that I see is, I've seen some people use Docker Compose 2.4 to wait for a health check for depends on. Anyone else do that? So Amr, can you share something about it?
Yes, I don't use, I use the 3.7 normally, and there is a bash script you can find on GitHub called wait for it or wait for. And I think that's pretty fine, right? So this bash script, what it will do is exactly what I said. It will just keep pinging the port until the health check of the other thing is there, and then you can just move on with the bash script, or just write your own. I honestly don't think you should block yourself on an older version of Docker Compose because you want to make use of one feature that you can replace that simply. I hope that answers the question.
I think it answers the question. I have another question because, well, what you're saying is, well, you should focus on usage. You shouldn't focus on we're going to use that new brand spanking tool that we get to use just because we can use it. How would you deal with colleagues that are just going for the most shiny tool? And in this specific thing, how would that work out for you in a team that says, well, we just want to use Docker Compose because we can?
Honestly, I think like at least with me and the team, we have this exercise where we really want to question everything we are doing, right? So with my team, what we usually do is that we have a session usually called the pre-grooming, where we go through every single task we need to do. And we need to justify it to ourselves, not just to product, really, because usually people say, I will justify this to product. But for me, I believe that we as techies need to be aware of that. Like, is this something that is really useful? Is this something that will really bring money to this company, or at least make us, make our time usage much better? I think we as developers need to start to be aware of how our time is. And I don't know, I think it comes from just talking to the team and doing it more often, until it becomes really an exercise. At the moment, I think, unlike what usually people say that developers are trying to push product to do things, I think it's usually us even pushing back against product, and that happened by practice. So,
okay. I have another question. That is, what do you think about pre-built stack images like Passenger Ruby and such?
I didn't have any personal experience, so I cannot really give like a feedback on this. So.
But more in general, I mean, not specifically this image.
In general, I would have a problem. I prefer things when I understand what's going, inside this package. So if I have a pre-built image, I wouldn't be so comfortable, I have to admit, right? Like, as I said, I'm even not comfortable with base images that are official from Ruby, because even that can break. So you are adding more and more layers on the top of that. I'm not really sure that's what you need, honestly. Like, I would never do something like this. But I don't know, maybe it works for other people.
I know, I understand, but from time to time, you just want to use a specific library or a gem in Ruby terminology that you think is going to solve all your problems, but you're going to inspect our code anyway before, well, depending on it. And this is just, well, not very much different than a library you're depending on, except it's just sitting underneath a lot of things. What's your opinion about that then?
I think that's a very good question. I honestly, maybe we are still in an era where my trust in Docker-based images is not as. Let's be honest about that. Like there was even this incident a couple of years ago where like even the MySQL Docker-based image was doing phishing and stuff like that. So I wouldn't.
Yeah.
Like I'm still not in that era yet, but of course, I mean, yes, if you have the time to inspect the code of the base image and keep track of what's going on, go for it. I personally just feel it's quite straightforward to add those couple of few lines more. So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember being at a bigger corporation. They said, well, we can only use our own built Docker images because, well, we can't use it we can't run our systems on anything that we didn't build ourselves, which, well, you may or may not see as an advantage. But yeah, with Ruby gems, you have the same kinds of problems. So yeah, I think I understand what you mean with this. If you can't inspect it or if you don't have the time to inspect it, you probably don't want to build everything on top of it. I'm just looking at my colleagues if we have any more questions coming up. No, that we don't have any questions that I want to ask you at the time. So this is where I get to thank you.
Thank you so much,
for your talk.
Everyone. Yeah.
And you were in that rocket again. You were going very fast, but it was, well, it was very good to follow. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Arno, and have a good evening. Ciao.
Yes, ciao.